Well, good morning. It's a rainy day here in Tempe. It's actually a nice day. We need the rain, I guess. So, at any rate, the morning is starting off with a bang. My Ethernet is down, and had to call them, and well, they're working on it. They know about it. And then I sat down here to do the video, and I didn't have a shirt on. I felt like that maybe my aunt down in Fort Lauderdale would not be too happy seeing me without a shirt on again, so I put on a shirt. This thing is, I believe it's called a caftan, and it's very comfortable. Reaches down to my ankles. Very comfortable. Have a coffee sitting here. And then I sat down again to start the video, and I didn't have my earphones on, so I said, oops. So at any rate, let's get started. This is going to be kind of an interesting day. Well, Mack and his Kyoto family were really close, and they didn't really spend a lot of time entertaining and all that. They were kind of homebodies. So Mack, Mitsuko, Mary, and Seuss were sitting in the family room one evening waiting for Shin to come home. Shin had called and said that one of the other staff in his project had invited him home for supper. He told them that he had in turn invited Pinky to accompany him. They found themselves reading and talking quietly while they waited for his arrival. Well, let me stop for a second. This section is really kind of personal, and it's unusual. And when it started with Shin calling and saying that he had been invited for dinner, and that even was unusual. But at any rate, I'm not really sure exactly what happened, but when I was writing it, it was like this was kind of unusual that Shin had done this, and the way it turned out was not really part of the story. It was family stuff. Well, I don't mind mixing it up, but this is a science fiction story, and this didn't really fit, but I decided that I would go ahead and write it anyway. And, I didn't decide to write it, it just sort of boiled out. When it was all over, it was like I was very emotional. So you may find that that this next part might be a little emotional for you too. You might get a little weepy. I don't know. It's different people, different strokes, I guess. So at any rate, they were waiting for Shin, and the door opened, and Shin and Pinky came into the family room. Pinky went around the room giving each of them hugs and kisses, and then excused herself to home. Oh, Pinky and Mary actually had quickly become valued members of Shin's inner circle, and indeed were picked up at 0800 with Shin in the morning to go to the labs. But none of the rest of the group had done this. So Shin sat down and began to speak. He said that this evening had gone well. Pinky had performed admirably as Shin's escort and his consort and had helped make the evening a success. He said that for some reason there was a sort of uncomfortable feeling he couldn't identify with the woman's husband. He said he didn't talk much and actually seemed estranged from daughter Drella somehow, who Shin proceeded to talk about. Shin said that there was this young girl in the home who had gone out of her way to help make the dinner a success. Her name was Drella. He said that he had invited her to come visit tomorrow afternoon, and that he hoped she would become a frequent visitor. Shin said that I like her, but not as a girlfriend, but as a young friend for you, my father. I started and said that I would indeed make her comfortable when she showed up. Mitsuko, Mary, and Sue said that they had a shopping trip planned, so that would mean Mack would have the house to himself to get acquainted with Drella. Shin said that the youth's name was usually shortened to Drella, and that you should actually start to call her by that. Well, that name was really nice. I like that name. It's almost like an airborne maneuver called a chandelle. And then when Shin told us that her name was usually shortened to Drella, double L, then I thought, if there was any kind of Spanish influence in her family, they would probably call her Drea. But then I thought, well, my mother's name is Stella, double L, and so I thought, yeah, okay, Drella. Well, I thought tomorrow would be interesting. The next morning, about 0900, my phone rings. I move my eye, and it connects. Woman speaks and says her name is Swandar. She frequently is called Swan for short, and she is Drella's mother. I said, hello, how are you? We exchanged pleasantries, and she finally said that she and a friend were going to be out of town until tomorrow evening, and she wanted to know if I ever watched young girls overnight. I said that I had grown up with lovely young girls, and I had no problem with Drella's overnight stay. I said I would love to have her. Swan then said if I didn't mind, she would send her on over with a small bag for the night. I said goodbye after assuring Swan I would look after her. Have fun on your visit out of town, I added. Well, I went out on the front porch and sat down. I heard a youthful voice singing some indiscriminate tune as I sat. This young girl of maybe 12 comes tripping up the walk. She stops as she approached the steps up to where I sat. She looks at me and says, "Are you Mack?" I shook my head, yes. Well, she continued saying, "I was hoping you would be a little older, and you look to be just about right." She asked if she could come up. I moved my hand outstretched with the palm down and waved her to me. As she approached, she asked, "What is that sign you just made?" I told her that that's the way Oriental people indicate you should come closer. I told her that holding your palm up and doing the come hither sign is a sign in some cultures that indicate they want to fight you. So to be careful, I try to always do the palm down motion to come closer. Well, from that time on, all day long, Drella and Mack just sort of, they really got along. It was like they just kind of talked their legs off, and Mack found out about a lot about Drella, not so much about her family, but they just talked about school and the climate, and they just got into everything. Well, finally, it got to be kind of a little late in the afternoon, and they kind of got wound down, but they were starting to get kind of close, and Drella said she kind of needed to take a nap, that she was about ready to fall over. Well, Mack got her into the family room, and there was a long couch, and they just laid down together, and turned out they were both really pretty affectionate, and didn't make any big deal about giving hugs and everything. So they laid down together, and Mack put his arm around her, and Drella put her leg over Mack's, and they just sort of got comfortable and fell asleep. Well, Mitsuko, Mary, and Seuss found us fast asleep in the den, sleeping closely in each other's arms. Well, I woke up first, and Seuss shook me awake and asked if your friend was going to spend the night. The other two, Mitsuko and Mary, are you blind? Of course she's going to spend the night. What's your name, honey? I told the crowd that this precious one's name is Jondrelle. Short as Drellin is pronounced, well, Drea, but not really. Long form is pronounced Jondrea. Mary said, welcome to the family, Drella. Drella yawned and smiled. She said, I'm hungry. What's for supper if I'm in the family now? Well, it turned out that Drella was an instant hit with the family. Notwithstanding that I had essentially things going on with Susan Mary with Mitsuko's approval, I was approaching a threshold on Prime with another person on a different planet of another culture of which I knew little. I felt I could only benefit by slowly incorporating her into our family in truth. Her mother called the next day to tell me they were home. I told her I would walk Drella home and meet her and her husband. She corrected me by saying that the one she had taken off for the weekend with was not her husband, and in fact was unmarried. She told me Drella and she lived alone, and Drella was frequently by herself while she worked on Shin's project as a lead engineer on propulsion. Well, I walked Drella home and met her mother and was invited in. As we stood in the entrance, I found her mother to be nice, but not at all my idea of someone I could ever call my friend. She just didn't seem to fit. She was pleasant, though. I looked from her to Drella and thought that She looked anxious. Like, talking about Drella. She says, like I may not like her anymore if I didn't like her mom. I thought in this case an instant decision was called for. I looked at Swan and told her that Drella was an instant hit with my family, and after only one short 2-day visit felt like she was a part of the family already. Well, I told Swan that the four of us would really like it if Drella could come and stay with us for some time period, like a week or two if she could swing it. I said that we would make sure she gets home, she gets to school. The only thing we would ask is that Drella have access to their home for her clothes while she stayed with us. If she had work that called for her immediate attention and couldn't be there. I looked down at Drella and I saw such relief on her face I couldn't believe it. I looked back at Swan and saw yet another facade fading in and out. Swan herself gave me such a look of gratitude that I thought I had come through for her just in the nick of time. Well, I heard a cough off inside the home. Seemed to be masculine in nature. Drella started, and I could have sworn that Swan flinched. I made another command decision. I told Swan, who had yet to invite me into her home, that acting on a quirk in my personality, I had just decided to ask if Drella could come spend a month or two with us starting tonight. I stopped talking and watched Swan and Drella exchange looks. Drella said, "Please, Mom?" Swan looked back at me and nodded yes. She turned to Drella and said she has her key and she could go tonight and come back tomorrow when the place was empty with one of your other family to gather up some clothes. She asked Drella if that would be okay. Well, Drella looked like she was about to cry. She said, "Mom, thank you. I'll be good." Well, Mary heard us come in with our quiet talk. She came to the front foyer and gathered Drella into her arms and gave her a tight hug and a kiss. She told us that she was sure Drella would be coming back to stay. Mitsuko and Zeus had by then made her way to us, and it was like old home week, with a lot of hugs and kisses. I won't say which of us had to go get tissues to clean up the tears. It was a happy home that night. Well, years later, Drella was still with us. We seemed to be comfortable, all of us together. Well, Swan had contacted us shortly after Drella had come to us and asked us if we wanted to adopt Drella. And we sent word back, of course we would. A few short months later at a local courthouse, the deed was done. Drella never told us what had prompted that episode, but we counted our lucky stars that she had appeared in our lives at exactly the right moment. Excuse me. Well, Shin came home late on a Friday a few weeks later, came into the family room and poured himself a beer. He sat, and after his unusual pouring of a beer, which was very unusual, he took a big swallow and smacked his lips. We all sat up a little in our chairs. Mitsuko and Seuss, I noticed, sat up, but Mary sat up and leaned forward in her chair. We all looked at Shin, and after a moment, Shin noticed us looking at him and said, "What?" Mary said that you don't usually have a beer when you come home. You have something to say? Well, Shin sort of shifted in his chair and coughed. He took another big swig of his beer and said that, yes, he did have something to say. As he began to speak, it was obvious he had been mulling over how to break the news to us. He said that he had been really unsure how to begin. So he began. I decided that I would just lay it all out for us. He continued by saying that he was going to tell all, even though he knew the government was monitoring what he was saying, but he said that he had already scheduled a group meeting of all the local and state managers of the project and all the staff for 1000 hours in the morning to tell them his findings. He said to us that even if the news broke early because of the bugging, it wouldn't make any difference, as his staff had already discovered that he had made a breakthrough. He said they had no clue what that was, so they would have to wait in any event. He said that that's the way he had decided to proceed. He said, "Dad, I have come up with a solution to the space travel question. In fact, I have come up with 2 solutions. One is brute force, and another with finesse. It involves the use of the transfer technology that has been missed for all these years." He continued saying, "It involves using the technology in a new way. In fact," he continued, "it is a way that I discovered due to a simple mistake in the transfer equations." He said that he had been given access to the equations with nothing held back. He said that the equations had apparently not been questioned in all the years and centuries it had been in use because, simply put, it worked and worked well. He said that his work had mainly been to do an exhaustive, in-depth review of the equations, and he found the flaw in 5 days. He said that the first time he looked at the flaw, he knew he had solved the problem. He said that then and there he could see both solutions, a brute force solution that could be radioed to the prime spaceship on its way to the Centauri system, and the so-called finesse way that would actually make a race of it to their target. He said that it is a toss-up as to which solution would make it there first. Shin continued saying that he wanted all of us from both planets to be at the project auditorium at 1000 hours in the morning. He said that he had already arranged for both families to be picked up by shuttle at 0930 for the trip. He said that he would then expose the flaw and explain the solutions to everyone. Until then, he said, he intended to have a few beers. He asked Mary to call next door and tell them what he had just said and to let them know about the shuttle at 0930. Well, Shin left before 0600 the next morning with the shuttle called to pick him up early. The rest of us were all out in front of 1001 and 1002 Shermwood Place at 0930. The sleek-looking black project shuttle and what looked like a dozen or more similar vehicles were in the process of picking up families all over the compound as we climbed aboard. It looked like it was going to be a full house this morning. Hundreds of people were filing into the auditorium in front of us. Donia met us at the door and escorted us down to a roped-off area in the front row. The project head met us at the door and escorted us down to take that back. The project head met us and welcomed us to the presentation. He said that if you have any details of what Shin's remarks were going, what Shin was going to say, that we should just keep it to ourselves. He said with a grin that he knows Shin's remarks were going to be a brand bruner. I had to laugh at the awkward pronunciation of what used to be a common, for me at least, saying identifying a substantial and informative speech. I shook his hand and sat down with the family. Well, at 1000 hours promptly, Shin walked out on the stage to thunderous applause. He grinned his youthful grin and reached to his waist to enable his voice pickup. He pulled a handheld device from his pocket that was used to control the audio-video presentation. He began by thanking everyone for coming. He said he was sure a lot of attention was being paid to what it was he was going to show us, so he said he would begin. He cleared his throat and started. He said that he had come from E-23 specifically to solve the spacecraft propulsion system question. He said, you all know that the prime developed method of travel, translation, was solved centuries ago for travel between Earths and somewhat between local moons and, in 2 cases, planetary travel to Mars and Europa. Problem is that that's very local in the celestial scheme of things. The nearest star system, the Centauri, has until now been forever out of our reach. We need to visit such places. My task has been to solve that problem. Until a few days ago, I have not had a clue as to how to proceed. Well, the audience seemed to be uneasy a little bit with those words. When I heard the shuffling and movements of 3,000, I thought they were showing their worry that Shin was going to tell him he still had not discovered the solution, but that he had made great progress and to ask for patience in his search. Well, Shin continued saying that he had been given total access to the transfer equations. He paused. He walked a few paces to his left and then back to center stage. He looked at the crowd and then focused his attention on the front row where we sat. He said, "Dad, I have solved the question." As I told you last night, I have two solutions, a brute force method and one of finesse. He was repeating the words he said to us last night, but I thought he could not improve on them, no longer how long it took him. The audience sat silently and then began clapping. They started to stand as they clapped and then began cheering. It was pandemonium. After a few moments, Shin raised his arms and motioned for quiet. The assembly slowly quieted, and finally everyone was seated and silent. Shin said it was now time to show some details. He said that some of the engineers and scientists would be able to follow his explanation of the solution, but for the rest of us, follow along anyway, because I'll show you pretty graphically how it works in practice. He clicked on his handheld. A large screen behind him illuminated. It showed rows and rows of equations. Shin said this is part of the transfer equations. In fact, he said it's about 1% of the total. He turned to the audience and said that for ones of you familiar with them, this page is number 45. He said a flaw exists here. He continued by saying that maybe he could call it a self-induced limit that made sense when the transfer equations were being developed. He said, I'm going to go in slowly to the flaw. He clicked on a button and one could begin to see a very small red dot appear near the center of the page. Well, he increased the magnification, and finally the red circle surrounded a single value in decimal. It was 0.000000001. Shin said that this is a microsecond in decimal. I think it's an error to call for 1 microsecond here. It should be a variable. Here's why, he continued. This is the period the field is open during translation. The actual period of time required for the translation to complete is 1 cycle of an electron around its nucleus. That's it. The scientists knew it was a very small time, and reasoning that if the field was held open longer than necessary, some gas and other contaminant would intrude and cause difficulty. They thought that if they held it open for 1 microsecond, it would be a safe bet. Nothing untoward would happen. Well, turns out that there is a perfectly valid reason to hold it open, even if it is an indefinite time period. For example, he continued, there's an industry supplying fresh water all over the planet and uses the transfer technology to hold open a field port into a freshwater lake in Rosandia. It looks like the waterworks people have never told the transfer people they did that. The crowd started to titter, and then, absorbing these facts, started laughing. Well, Shin grinned. His image, which was displayed on locally located screens around the auditorium, showed his broad smile. Shin continued, saying that now he was going to go into his brute force solution, which directly benefits the Prime spacecraft presently on its way to the Centauri system. Shin clicked his handheld. The main screen showed a semi-desert area with a white concrete structure sitting in the near distance. Shin told the crowd that it was 10 miles from the camera to the engine enclosed in that structure. He said the engine discharge is angled up 30 degrees from level. He said, when we light this thing off, we don't want to blow houses off their foundations 10 miles away. He said that here's the proof of the brute force. Shin said that the engine was very simple. I hope I'm not giving away secrets someplace in some government, but 2 variable 5-inch volume transfer ports were in place on either side of a rocket bell. One port is open to our nearly endless water supply, and the other is open to the photosphere of the sun. The variability is a shutter arrangement. Both ports are cooled by water from the lake. The port is underwater at about 1,000 feet, which provides plenty of pressure. The water will be turned on first to cool the bell and the sun port. Shin paused and said to the audience that all this had been built in the last 2 weeks and that there had been no testing. Frankly, I don't see any reason to not do this test right off the bat. It is such a simple process that has been in use for thousands of years here on Prime. Well, Shin firmly faced the crowd and said, "Are you ready?" The crowd responded with a hearty cheer, and many voices cried out, "Hit it!" Shin turned to the display and offered this simple command: "Turn on the water." Well, first a small cloud of water vapor was seen as the aperture was opened a very small amount. Then more and more was observed as the opening went to a full 5-inch. A great gout of water was seen fully 100 feet in the air and falling to the desert ground as mist a half-mile away. Open the sun port slowly to full open, taking 1 minute to open, Shin commanded. Well, immediately the water stream gained luminance. It began to brighten, and at 10 seconds, the water stream disappeared and a rocket plume appeared. The water went incandescent as it brightened, and then the camera had to stop down to keep from burning it out. Shin asked for the camera to pull back to show the full rocket stream. Pulling back showed the rocket plume reaching fully 10,000 feet in altitude. Well, Shin asked for the Phoenix airport cam to turn to the southeast. Well, that showed the plume extending to what appeared to be the top of the troposphere. Wow. The auditorium was silent as the sound from outside came through the thick walls. Everyone in the hall began looking around to find the source of the sound. Shin said simply, "This is the rocket sound from 15 miles away." I didn't turn my phone off. He turned to the display and gave the command to slowly shut down the sun port. The sound from outside slowly faded away. The rocket slowly dimmed and went to just the water plume, and then to the initial dribble, and then a plain white structure in the middle distance. Shin then announced that this new way of powering spacecraft was in the process right now of being transmitted to the prime spacecraft. He explained that the PSC had plenty of spares to build at least 2 of these engines, and had the coordinates for the water and the preferred sunport location. Shin said that he thought it would only take a couple of weeks to build 2 of them and light them off and leave them on all the way to the Centauri system. Of course, they'd have to turn them around halfway there, one way accelerating and the other way decelerating. He told the crowd that leaving them on continuously, set to 1 gravity, would allow a tremendous velocity to be achieved. This would cut the time to target and then would allow the construction of a transfer gate on an appropriate planet, if found, he added. As the crowd absorbed this unbelievable display of brute force, they sat quietly. Shin gave them a minute. Shin then said that now he will explain how the second finesse worked. He clicked on his controller and a graphic appeared. This showed a representation of the Centauri system and the solar system with red circles every light year of the distance. Take a look at this, he said. He said, we already do this on a small scale. He talked to the crowd as if he was sitting in their living room. He explained that when the transfer system was being tried out, stretching and identifying the problems and capabilities, he told them that they had identified hundreds of years in the past the fact of what we know as the Lagrange points around the Earth. Numbered 1 through 5, they described the points where orbits of items parked there are somewhat stable. He told them the L5 points are preferable, so they tried identifying transfer points for a transfer of a self-contained transfer gate there. It worked. Also, he continued, this process of essentially guessing at the location of a temporary transfer point worked for the Moon, Mars, and Europa. The process then stopped until now. Seems like nobody could imagine guessing at a temporary waypoint on the way to Alpha Centauri. Shin said that this is his finesse process. Well, he said that since his rocket brute force method had been proven, he was now going to concentrate on developing the equipment to transfer temporary self-contained transfer gates and doing the steps to the Centauri system in 1 light-year steps. He said that he had already described the capabilities of placing a temporary transfer gate in space at an arbitrary point and inhabiting the temporary construct. Shin then closed his presentation by saying he was going to go for it, and then showed a repeat of the 2-port rocket experiment. The audience gave Shin a well-deserved final round of applause with whistles and cheers. Well, afterward, Shin had more than one beer as more than one young girl from the compound sat in his lap. Drella wore some skimpy little thing Seuss had just bought her, and more than once Shin was seen to caress her boobs as she sat in his lap. Even Seuss, while sitting on his lap, showed some temporary insanity by pretending to talk to someone over his shoulder, thus shoving her boob in his eye. I thought he was well equipped to handle just about anything, after his efforts in research showed the world the answers to that age-old question. Excuse me. Well, a few days later, Shin came home a little later than his usual time, and Mitsuko, Seuss, Drella, and I noticed. Most days since his formal announcement of the success of his search, he came home pretty much right on time. He seemed to be a little slow putting his stuff in his room and coming back out to the great room to get himself a beer. He sat in his usual seat and seemed to heave a small sigh. Well, I looked at him and asked him how his day had gone. He looked up briefly and then back down at his beer and then finally spoke. He looked at me and said, "I'm not happy. This whole thing is unclean. There has to be something I'm missing." He heaved a long, unmistakable sigh this time. I said that he might be able to get some insight into his discomfort by telling us about it. Well, he did. He spoke of his doubts and his continuing search for ways to improve the interstellar travel solution. He said again it was just unclean. He said that his solution gave Prime a way to get to Centauri, but it took many steps, and at the end of the day, only to Centauri. What about all the other stars? Do we have to go to each of them in 1 light-year steps? How about all the other thousands of potential Earth-like planets out there? We go there in 1 light-year steps? He repeated that he just didn't like it. It was just unclean. He was stuck on that term, but it suited the solution. It suited the situation. I said that maybe it would help to enumerate what it was he was searching for. Some of the things a clean spaceship would normally be capable of. I asked Shin if he had a list of such desirable traits of some mythical movie-like space travel machine, if you will. Shin looked up at me as I said that. He said that he did not have such a list, but that might be a good way to attack the problem. He got up and went to his room. He came back with a notebook, which apparently was nearly half full. Showed that he had actually used it for something. Drella had curled up beside him and was looking at the book on his lap as he jotted down a short list. Shin said that he first said that this spaceship had to be self-contained. He said it had to get off the planet unassisted. then had to identify a location to go to. He said that could be sloppy for the first step to another star, but could actually be useful for mapping various observation points on its way through the interstellar medium. He said that would be recorded from the very first trip. He said the drive system had to envelop the whole spacecraft, and because that may scoop out a lot of dirt and concrete if that field was energized on the ground, that's why the ship had to be able to get into space on its own. He continued saying the ship had to have a local drive, so to speak, to be able to land on that other planet or moon, and after some time be able to lift off again, then get back to Prime on its own. No support stations existed in the space between stars, so again it all had to be self-contained. Shin showed he was always on alert. As he continued his list, he suddenly stopped. His gaze seemed to be focused on nothing in particular in front of him. He was spaced out. He said low in his chest, "Oh, well." He seemed at that moment to be in a world of his own. He looked at his list and then closed the notebook. He looked around at his surroundings, seemingly for the first time today. He seemed to be gathering himself as he came alert in his usual demeanor. He looked at me for some moments. "Dad, I have solved the problem. We will have our spaceship. I suspect it will be called SS Prime 1 for Spaceship Prime 1. He continued that he intended to present the solution at another one of those special assemblies where he did his initial solution, tomorrow at 1300 hours. "Dad," he said, "the list you suggested showed me the path. It involves another flaw in the translator equations." He said that until this moment he didn't see it as a flaw, just a part of the normal workings of the translator. It involves setting the space for what is to be translated. That part of the equation detects what is physically in the local area that is not normally present. The equipment then sets the field to contain all that unexpected material, which may be people, material, boxes of any sort, piles of sand, anything at all not normally found in that space. Works perfectly for translation of practically everything you can pile in the cavity of the translator. What I'm going to do is to alter that so the field expands to include itself and enough distance from itself to contain the space expected to be a little bigger than the size of the spacecraft. That's why the spacecraft has to be airborne, and preferably in space. Otherwise, as I said, the field would encompass some of the ground the spacecraft sits on while on the ground. Well, not cool to take along 20 tons of dirt, gravel, and concrete. He continued saying the local drive would essentially be several small versions of the Sunport Lakeport engines demonstrated in his previous presentation. He said that those engines could be scaled up or down easily, and that the translator systems controlling each Essentially, it's in the form of a chip encased in a case less than an inch on a side, not a factor in an engine of this size. He told us that listening that these small engines could be throttled back to keep the thrust under 1G as planet maneuvering took place. He continued that his staff of design engineers would come up with a spaceship that would be self-contained and actually could build it anywhere there was a space to allow for the exhaust of the engines. Build it in pieces and truck it out to a remote airfield to be designated from now on as a spaceport. The spaceship could be pretty big, actually, as the design would specify how big to make the several engines to be installed. The translator could be a normal, everyday size unit, as it seemed to be able to translate any size to any time or location. Shin concluded by saying, "Dad, we're going to the stars in 0 time." Well, we're next. Hasn't been written yet, but next we're going to actually populate these spaceships and tag along as they go out into space. So, see you next time.